welcome to our first Better Business Writing Workshop on how to write clearly. I'm Micah McGuire, ProWritingAid's B2B Digital Marketing Manager, and today I am joined by none other than our very own AJ Ogilvie. Really can't imagine anyone better than AJ to speak on the topic of writing clearly, considering his background. He is an assistant professor of business communication at the University of Southern California, and he also happens to be our user researcher at ProWritingAid. He's spent over 10 years designing and teaching undergraduate and MBA level writing, consulting, and communication courses. He did his Ph.D. in language and literacy at UC Santa Barbara, and his primary research interests include writing development, knowledge transfer, and communication curriculum in higher education. So we have a great session in mind for you guys. I think you all are going to get a ton out of it. So without further ado, AJ, want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Micah. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today. I think clarity is one of the most complicated, challenging, and vexing aspects of writing. And there is by no means today I'm going to talk about some ideas and some key principles to clarity, but I also want everyone here to feel that they can jump in on the chat. I really want this to feel interactive. If you have a text, if you have an email that you've written and you'd like to use that today, I'm sure many of us have probably written emails in the past 5 minutes. A lot of these principles that we're going to talk about, you can really check against your writing in real time. And the more that you actually check your writing or kind of evaluate your writing through these principles, the more you'll probably, hopefully will find them helpful. So let's jump right in. I'm going to share my screen.
And guys, I do want to tack on that if you have any writing you would like to get AJ's opinion on, just get some editing suggestions, anything like that, please feel free to go ahead and throw that in the Q&A box. We promise we won't be pulling any names or anything like that, so it is totally anonymous. No worries about having your name called out while we're doing all this. Just if you have a passage you'd like AJ's opinion on, feel free to throw that in the Q&A box, and we will work on that during our Q&A session, which we'll probably have between 5 to 15 minutes, just depends on how many questions you guys have. We're aiming for this session to run about 45 minutes to an hour. So Q&A is totally up to you guys as to how long you guys would like to go.
Great. Thanks, Micah. Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, I've been teaching writing, and I'm sure many of you have been writing a lot in your life. And the best thing that we can do is sort of write a lot, take a look at it, revise it, try to see it through new lenses. And so, yeah, I definitely recommend or encourage anyone, if you want to share your writing, you can totally take a look at it. And I'll only be like a little bit mean, right? I won't be, no, I'm kidding. So let's jump in. So I just thought, you know, TLDR, right? Too long, didn't read. We live in a TLDR culture, for better or worse. So I just thought, what if I opened up today with just saying, let me just hit you with some of the biggest ideas of this presentation, just to really set it up. So first, the first big idea about clarity that I just want to emphasize is that clarity matters, right? And so you are a self-selected group. I probably don't need to tell you that clarity matters. You are here on this at this webinar, but I really just want to emphasize that I think sometimes we think, oh, it's okay if something's a little unclear, you know, and I do this myself. So clarity matters. We're going to talk about that a little bit. The other thing that we're going to get at is that this idea that clarity is not something so much that we can define in a sentence, but more from the perspective of a reader's experience. So clarity is in fact an experience of reading more so than it is this kind of decontextualized definition that we might be able to come up with. Another big idea of clarity is just this emphasis. I'm going to introduce some vocabulary that's probably not unusual to you, makes total sense, but it's this idea of like, we must be reader-centric. We must be reader-centric. And that means that we begin and do and end our writing thinking of our reader. So this is being reader-centric. And then the other thing that I want to talk about today is just this idea that sometimes I think when we think about clarity, we might think about clarity perhaps at just the sentence level, right? Like, what is a good sentence? But the truth is that clarity is really complex and interdependent in terms of macro and micro. So for example, you might write an email and you might have really clear sentences, but the ways that the email is structured isn't so clear. So clarity is operating on multiple levels. It's operating at a kind of a macro level, and it's also operating at a micro level. All right. So what is clarity? Actually, I want to throw this out to the crowd. Will everyone just throw in, not because I'm going to say they're wrong or right or anything like that, but more I just want to hear, can everyone write in the chat? A couple of words to help you define clarity, or how would you define clarity? 2 to 3 words, just go for it. And we'll let these ideas kind of roll in. So to the point. Yeah, Maria, exactly. Right. Direct, easy. I like that. Jacqueline, I agree. Yeah. Unambiguous. That's right. Like no one's wondering what's what. Yeah, like Chris, Southern girl, concise and context, right? Daladi is saying, yeah, these are great. These are great. Okay, cool. So here's how I'm going to define clarity today. And again, it's around this experience. And here's what happens when someone experiences clarity. They can find, they can understand, and they can act. So that is, they can find the information they need. They can understand that information once they found it, and then they can act on it. So let's go into that a little bit more. What do we mean by find? I do not need to tell any of you that sometimes, or I'm sure all of you have had this experience where you've gotten an email from work or from a colleague, or maybe some kind of, healthcare thing, and you just have zero idea what in this document is for you. Like, where in here is the thing that I need to do something, I need to know. You just can't find it. And so this is in many ways a function of the structure of the text. So when we want to establish clarity with our reader, we want to make sure that they can find the information. But finding it isn't enough, right? And these are all interrelated. Finding, understanding, and acting is that they must, once they find it, they must be able to understand it, to process it. And I recently was working with, my wife and I were working with a lawyer to do our trust and our will, like not fun stuff at all. And he would send us directions on how to sign the documents and send them back to him. And the lawyer complained, I give people these documents and then they take a month to send them back to me, or 2 months. And I told him, what I've realized is that he has not made it clear on how to sign them and how to send them back to him and how to do it. And so I don't understand how to do it. So understanding is key. And then lastly, once people can understand that, the next move is, what are we asking them to do? And acting doesn't necessarily mean send me this email by next week, or we need a decision on X by next week. But acting could really be just thinking in a particular way, so it could be depending on the kind of document, or you're presenting to colleagues or presenting to people or presenting to a VC or whatever it may be. You might say, you want them to think a particular way. So why does clarity matter? And again, I think I'm preaching to the choir here a bit. But to me, I think there's a couple things about it. And one that we often don't talk about is this idea of trust. And more and more, I've become obsessed with this idea of trust, especially as a teacher. I've thought more and more that, what are these powerful human impulses that are sort of driving us, and often driving us subconsciously, which makes them even more powerful. And more, I believe that trust is sort of, and it sounds cliched, it sounds like a platitude, but trust is really the beginnings of everything. And in business, I don't need to tell any of you that real long-term sustainable relationships among employees or with clients do not operate without trust. They, I'd argue they begin and end with trust. And so one of the reasons why I think clarity matters so much is that it is in fact the first experience of trust. That when someone understands who we are, what we need from them, how we want to work with them, that's the place that it begins. And I think at worst, the least generous interpretation of an email or a presentation in terms of clarity could be, if something is unclear to you, the least generous interpretation you might have is, I don't trust this person, they're hiding, they're doing this, they're doing this intentionally. And I don't think that's often the case. I think that's rare. But I do think from, just from a business perspective, that most people are not going to put money into something if they don't understand it, and if they don't understand the person who perhaps is asking for the money or the investment. And that goes to our second thing, is just clarity is about money. Simply that Josh Bernoff, a famous writing consultant, his study from 2016 found that about $400 billion a year is wasted in time and money in poorly written emails. And there's lots of statistics out there, but I think for me the most helpful one is that about half of our day is spent at work, is spent reading, reading emails or reading kinds of things. And if you think, if half of our day, 4 hours a day or 20 hours a week, if we could improve that by 15%, we would get back over time, like quite a bit of time. So clarity is really about money and about time. So there are 5 keys to clarity that I'm going to talk about. And one of the things I want to emphasize too is I want you to think about these flexibly and not so much, as rules, that shouldn't be broken, but as guiding principles. And that the premise is that if you use these keys in your writing, you are more likely to increase the clarity of the reader's experience. So first, why don't I'd love to kind of go into the chat and have everybody write just a little bit. Is, for you, I'd love to hear what's one of your own personal keys to clarity. Would you mind just writing like, I do this or I do that, or here's one way. I partly because I think it'd be nice for everyone else to get, I would learn from it too. I'm always looking for new ideas about how to be more clear. So I just love for here. Could everyone just put, like, you could write a sentence or two just in the chat boxes. What are your own approaches to clarity? I would love to hear that. So let's take a look here what people are saying. Yeah, I love Keisha's idea of 150 max. I love the idea of boundaries like that, or kind of constraints. Keeping it short. I really like Micah's idea of skeleton outlines. To me is huge, because I think you call it logic flows, which I talk about all the time. Is I think what happens when we start to write, we start to lose the macro perspective and we don't really know where we are anymore. So I do think skeleton outlines help. Yeah, those are some great ones. Bridget, I completely agree with you. Sometimes I think we think we need to kind of like, let me lay the groundwork here. And then as you're starting to lay the groundwork, well, I need to say that too. And I need to say that too. And then we find that, like, whoa, wait, we've kind of buried, as journalists say, buried the lead. Yeah, these are all great ideas. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of being reader-centric and not writer-centric, but I'm going to begin from this premise, is that you and I and everyone here on this webinar and every human is a powerfully writer-centric animal. Like we are naturally writer-centric. That is, we're always writing or communicating from our own mental model of the world and of the thing that we are talking about. The greatest example of this is Steven Pinker, the cognitive linguist at Harvard, talks about the curse of knowledge, and this idea that the more that you know something, the harder it is to explain to someone. And I think it's just such a great counterintuitive and just brilliant idea. And I often think what it is that the more that you know something, the harder it is to imagine not knowing that thing. And partly it's because the concept or whatever your knowledge is becomes so tacit and internalized that you don't even know it's a thing. And so this is really like one of the hardest parts about writing well, is that if we're not really careful, we are just going to write from our own perspective. And so this leads to the other premise of writing, which is that writing is imperfectible. You will be 50, 60, 100 years old, and you will still be growing as a writer, because we never eliminate the writer-centric impulses. Like, that is our baseline, that is our default. So it means that every time we go to write, we're having to work so hard to sort of restrain those writer-centric impulses and to be reader-centric. So let's jump in. And I think Anaïs Nin, the famous French theorist, kind of said it really thoughtfully and eloquently, is, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are, which I really like. Okay, so in a second, I'm going to we're going to use a model text today. And what I mean by a model text is that, in order to in order to really understand these clarity principles, we really need to see them in action. And so I just want to set this up a little bit. Warren Buffett wrote the preface for a plain English handbook, which was a document started in 1998, but there's also updates to it more recently in 2012. And basically the goal was, how do we get the financial industry to be more clear, to communicate better? I think we've all seen on our credit card or debit card, the text at the very bottom, it's completely indecipherable. So Warren Buffett, the famous American, billionaire, wrote a preface to it, and it's pretty short. You can see it on the right. And so what I'm going to do is I'd like everyone to read it. It's not very long. It should take roughly about 2 minutes. And if you don't finish, that's totally fine. But the idea is we're going to go back to we're going to kind of refer back to this model text as we talk about the principles. So let me just pop this into the chat real quick. Okay, so you'll see the link to a Google Doc in the chat, and if you wouldn't mind clicking on that, and then give it a read. It's 11:19. We'll just kind of whoops, actually I realized I did not send it to everybody. So here we go. Now you should be able to see the Google Doc, and I'll have other people with me in the Google Doc. Great. So yeah, great. So if you could just take a read of this, take till 11:22, 11:23. Again, no rush. I know everyone reads at different paces, and then we'll come back and we'll start to look at these principles. All right, so we'll take about 1 more minute. And if you're done reading, you can reread it. Okay, let's jump in. And so what I'd love to hear from anyone in the chat is, we can all, writing is very subjective, and so is clarity, but I generally think this is a pretty clear, that in terms of clarity, this is pretty clear. So for any of you who might share this view, do you want to put in the chat, like, what do you think what is one element or two elements that make this preface clear? Just to get you thinking about it a little bit before we kind of talk about it. But I'd love if you would just write in the chat, what do you think for you, what was like, what are some strategies that Buffett was using that made this preface relatively clear? Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump in. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. This is kind of, Keisha, it's, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Keisha, it's kind of meta, right? This is a reader-centric document telling people how to be reader-centric, which I thought was cool. And yeah, Donnie, yeah, the relatableness, Chris Southern Girl, I think that is Warren Buffett's bread and butter, right? Like the average Joe writes like the average Joe. I mean, who doesn't have a Dear Doris and Birdie, right? So yeah, no jargon, exactly. All right, great. So let's just jump in. So there's the first, key to clarity, and I call it one big idea, OBI, one big idea. And again, I think reasonable people can disagree with this, but I think that every text, presentation, speech, everything you produce, I'd argue just it always has to be able to be reduced to one big idea. And of course, that one big idea will invariably leave important information out. But the reader or the audience remains better off as a result of still having that one big idea. And I think, so the overall text, so this preface or anything you're writing, an email, a report, anything, it should have one big idea. And the idea is that a week later, if someone says, if I write something and a week later someone says, hey, AJ, or hey, Rick, what was AJ's email about? Rick needs to be able to remember that email and that one big idea. And this is the science of stickiness, right? And I think generally what we don't do is when we email people or when we write things to people, we have many ideas. And what they're looking for is what is the one thing? And of course, there's things under that big idea. But I think OBI is just a key principle. So an overall text should have one big idea, but a paragraph too should have one big idea. And then a sentence should have one big idea. And obviously, this is sort of a Russian doll kind of metaphor, that everything's linked, and just at scale, everything just looks a little bit different. So, yeah. So one big idea. Where is Buffett's one big idea? And in a way, I would argue it's in this first paragraph, and that were I to read nothing else than this first paragraph, I'd get it. And for me, and sometimes what it is the one big idea is it sometimes it comes out at us and it's extremely explicit, and sometimes it's a little more layered. I think Buffett's is sort of in between, but basically what he like, and if I had to remove every single sentence from his preface except for one, I think it's this. It sounds funny, but this handbook and Chairman Levitt's whole drive to encourage plain English and disclosure documents are good news for me. I think basically if we link this preface to the overall aims of the handbook, the SEC wants Warren Buffett's endorsement of plain writing. So another one big idea could in fact also be like, Warren Buffett says that if people write more clearly, if corporate lawyers and their clients follow this handbook, their life is going to become much easier. So this is Warren Buffett's one big idea. Now, if you do have a text right now, if you have an email that you've written, I know this can feel a little prescriptive and maybe a little over the top or overstated, but I think we're far more likely to have 10 big ideas than one big idea. So if we push to get one big idea, but we have two, that's far better than having 7 or 8. So maybe take a look at your document or anything you've written and ask yourself, anything recently, like, is there one big idea in here? And this kind of relates to what we're going to talk about too, is that often some of you might be wondering, well, if you are going to have one big idea, where would you put it? And this is going to relate to the next part of it, which is structure. And so, but to think about it, let's just think kind of on a basic level. There's this thing called the Ebbinghaus curve, which basically states that people pay attention to the beginning and ending of things. It sounds about right? And it doesn't mean that the middle is not important. It just means that people pay more attention to the beginning and end. When you're at a speech or something and someone says like, in conclusion, and and then you start to sit up, right? Because you go, oh, this is the end, I should pay attention. Where is the one big idea generally found in an overall text? I would argue it's usually found at the beginning or at the end, or even better, it's at the beginning and at the end, depending on the complexity of the idea. But we know humans love big ideas at the beginning or at the end. And this relates to our next thing is, I would argue that most of us would benefit significantly from just using a simple structure for everything that we write. Here's what I think. We have to go to write something new. We are writing about some kind of complex issue. We're trying to tie it down. We don't really know exactly what we want to say. And if we were to just use simple templates, simple structures, simple formulas, I would argue we'll write more quickly. And if you're familiar at all with academic articles or academic publishing, one of the reasons why a lot of professors and scholars can produce lots of articles is because the structure for academic articles is essentially the same. It's always the same. So there's a particular formula that you just have to plug in. And so not only do simple structures help us, the writers, but more importantly, perhaps, they help readers. And if you think of these three structures that I'm going to throw at you, that I'm going to introduce, and I want to make it clear that these structures will often have a little bit of, they'll riff off of things, or there's variations, but generally these are big, kind of big anchoring structures, and they anchor the logic of your ideas for the reader. And it's not because the structure, the logic of these structures works for you, but it's also just like how humans work. So if I tell you that I have a problem, what you might wonder is, well, what's the solution? And so that's the first structure, is if we set something up, here's this problem, people kind of, they're starting to understand, the reader's starting to understand, oh, there's a problem. And then when you provide the solution, they understand the relationship between these two ideas and the connection between them. It's kind of baked into the structure. Often really good problem solution structures have what's called a bliss section. And I think most of us fail to do the bliss part. We don't always have to do it. Karen Duarte has come up with this, Nancy Duarte, who's a famous communication consultant. But it's this idea of like, we often tell people the problem, we tell them the solution. Now build out a world for the reader where that solution is in that world, right? Like, so what will the world look like if this solution is in fact implemented? This is bliss. And readers love it, right? Readers love it because it's not just a solution, but it's almost you're gaming it out. You're playing the movie of the world with the solution in it. Another structure that I think is really helpful and very similar to the first one is what, so what, now what? And I think the so what, this is a little bit of my structure for this webinar, to be honest, is what are we talking about? We're talking about clarity. And then one of my first slides was, so what? Why does it matter? And I think often what happens is we're writer-centric and we're talking about something and like, of course, this matters to me. I don't need to sell you on this, right? And other people are saying, no, like, actually, I don't know why we're even talking about this. I don't know why we should care. And and your challenge is to try to bypass your own reasons for thinking why it matters and think of, other reasons why it might matter to the reader. This is the art of teaching, right? That, I'm a 41-year-old dad. My 19-year-old students don't see the world the same way I do exactly. So I need to figure out how my upper division writing course might matter to them. What are the stakes? And, it's not why I think it matters, right? But why the students think it matters. And that's my challenge. So, and then the last one I really like too, and some of you have kind of referenced it, is BLUF. So BLUF stands for bottom line up front. I think, I roughly super rough guess is that 60 to 70% of texts are benefit from BLUF. I think that most of us would love just someone saying right up front, like the first sentence, I need this from you by next week, even if you don't know what this is, you at least know like the action, right? So this comes out of McKinsey and the pyramid principle, Barbara Minto. And so you would say, here's the bottom line. I need this by next week. And here's 3 reasons why. And that 3 reasons becomes the pyramid, right? And that's the logic that holds up the BLUF. And then I like to come back to the BLUF at the end. And to me, this is the hyper clarity. Like I often think of, if you're writing a technical manual, if you're writing instructions for something that's very dangerous, like in the medical field or something, like I think this kind of thing is critical. The bluff, like, hey, like if we don't do this, people will X, or and then you got to come back to it to restate it. Like I'd call this hyper clarity. The opposite of bluff, pyramid bluff, is like a novel, right? Literature or something. Like we don't want to know what to think. We want to work on it ourselves. The author often doesn't want to hit us over the head with how we want to think about these characters. So, but this is I really like bluff and pyramid and bluff. And this is what Buffett does, right? So he really sets out the problem at the very beginning. He even uses the word problem. Like he says, perhaps the most, in this bottom, he says, perhaps the most common problem, however, and he's really trying to say, here's the problem with unclear writing. And then what does he offer us? The solution. And he offers, and I really like what he does he does a very subtle bliss. So he says, the solution is this handbook. This handbook is the solution to the problem of bad financial writing. And then he goes one step further, which I think is great, is like, rather than say like, this will help with bad writing, he'll say, what's the bliss? Like, what would the world look like? And I think he's also being very reader-centric when he says, to write clearly, you'll be amazed that your readers think you're so smart, right? Which is of course flattering to all of us. Who doesn't want to come across as smart? So this is Buffett's structure, which I think is very simple, very cool. Again, it doesn't feel templatey. You probably wouldn't read this structure naturally into it when you're reading organically, but when we look at it a little bit closely, that's kind of what's going on. All right. So the other thing I want to talk about briefly is just this idea of like really 30,000 feet. We're looking down at a document that we have to design for clarity. And most of us make subconscious judgments of a text before we read it. So even just looking at a text will make you think, I don't want to read that, or I do. And so overall, we want short paragraphs, roughly 3 to 5 sentences. We want short sentences. Humans love short sentences. They don't have to work. Humans don't like thinking, right? And so 20 words on average. Again, these are rough guidelines. Like I don't want anyone thinking that you can't break these. But again, if you follow these, they're more likely to increase your clarity. Humans love white space and bullet points. That's really the benefit of bullet points. Bullet points tell the reader, I have organized my thoughts for you. So, I'm doing the work for you. And in a way, I kind of want I think we want to make a document look snackable. Like, oh yeah, I could read that, and I'm not gonna feel bloated afterwards or something. I'm not gonna feel exhausted after eating that. We want a snackable. Like, yeah, I can process that. And so here's an example of, I've seen this. I'm sure you've all seen this, like the big, 15 sentence, one paragraph, which just, I don't think anybody wants to read that. But if you look over on the right, this is what, there's a lot of white space. These paragraphs don't look very long. This just feels, the dreaded wall of text. Exactly. Like this just feels snackable. Okay, cool. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, so hopefully you're seeing we're kind of going macro to micro, right? We're going big to small. And now what I want to talk about is the subjects of your sentences. And 4 big ideas around subjects. So, we all were taught, subjects and verbs, tense agreement, et cetera. But we weren't really taught about how to select great subjects and how subjects are arguably the heart of clarity, that if a sentence is not working, it's likely. My argument is it's likely because the subject is not so great. And we'll talk about what's make a great subject right now. So the fewer different subjects you have, the better. That is, like, if you're writing something and the subject of your sentence is never repeated across these sentences, or if you're always introducing a new subject, it means your reader is constantly having to encounter and process a new character, a new concept, a new idea. It's a lot of work. We should always put subjects at the beginning of sentences. This is kind of like a bluff version at the sentence level. Like people like, tell me the big thing that I can hold on to right away. And then the most important thing is that subjects should be concrete, vivid, and quickly processed. And we'll use a couple of examples to see what I mean. So I went through Buffett's preface, and these are all of the subjects of his sentences. And what you can see is like all of these subjects are concrete insofar as you can visualize them, like you can quickly process them. So when he says this handbook, I know what he's talking about. When he says I know he's talking about Warren Buffett. When he talks about corporate lawyers and clients, I get that. Liars, like accidental there. My wife's an attorney, so it's okay. But corporate liars and clients, the writer, this handbook, all of these subjects, what it means is that every time the reader comes to a new sentence, they're processing it really quickly. Like they're not working. So let's see an example of what it would look like to take one of Buffett's clear sentences and break the principle of clarity with subjects and make it difficult. And what you'll see is, so I'll read this first one. This is the bad one. The prospect that disclosure documents will be written with this handbook and Chairman Levitt's whole drive to encourage plain English are good news for me. So I'm sure some of you have seen sentences like this a little bit, but what you'll see is that the subject here is this huge bolded part, and that is not concrete. It is not snackable. It's not easily to process. It's just not easily processed. It's just not a good sentence. It's not easy to process it as a reader. And this was the original, this handbook, which is the subject, and Chairman Levitt's whole drive, which is also part of the subject. This is vivid. This is concrete. I can easily process this subject. So this is an example. A little bit more about this is they're called nominalizations, which sounds like a jargon word, but anytime you start a sentence with like an ION word, it often means that you're going to make your reader do some real work. Academic writing, they love nominalizations, and academic readers know that they're going to work. So there's a sort of everybody's happy, but in business writing, we just want to understand, and we don't really want to work too hard. So you can see, I'll give you an example. This sentence here uses a nominalization. So the honest negotiations between the various suppliers increase the likelihood that a deal would be made. So not a terrible sentence, but not a great one, right? Like kind of stumble a little bit, a little clunky, a little bit of friction, a little bit of rereading, but this is better. The suppliers negotiated honestly, which increased the likelihood a deal would be made. Readers prefer this second sentence much more than the first one because they can hold on to the concreteness of the suppliers. That's just easy. They're going to have to work more for the first one. The honest negotiations between the various suppliers, then we get the verb. That's clunky. All right, so this first one I really love, and it's often hard, like it really feels really counterintuitive to me, but it just is so powerful, especially when you're building sentences, is this super obvious concept that when we build sentences, we should start with old knowledge and then add the new knowledge onto the old knowledge. And so the idea is, another way of framing it is start with what the reader knows and then add the new information on top of that. Whenever we're writing about something new, and this happens to my students all the time, is they're always writing about something new and they haven't really organized their thinking, and they likely have 20 disparate kinds of ideas that they want to communicate. And what they'll do is they'll just start a sentence with an entirely new idea. And I'm like, I've never heard of this before. You're just introducing this idea. This isn't old knowledge. This is new knowledge to me. And so essentially what happens is that our entire text is a sort of movement, a circular pattern of old and new, old and new, old and new. And the reader just kind of cruises with you because they're always like, I know what you're talking about. I'm sure we all have friends who are horrible storytellers, right? We all have those friends. None of us are bad storytellers because we're on this webinar, but I'm sure that we all have friends who are horrible storytellers. And we often say like, we'll go, who are you talking about? Like who? I don't even know. And they'll go, you know, John. And you're like, yeah, I know John. Like, okay, well, John is, and that's like what they're doing is that's their second draft of that sentence using old knowledge, John, which I know John, and then adding the new knowledge onto the old knowledge. And so in this, these colors are a little bit wild, but in these two sentences, this is Buffett's, these are two sentences from Buffett's preface, and you'll see that the orange is the old knowledge. And he builds this new stuff, the ideas that he wants to introduce to his reader, he builds it on what the reader knows. So he says this handbook, and the reader knows the handbook. And he says, here's what it'll do. And this is something you don't know. It'll tell you how to free yourself of those impediments to effective communication. He does this in the next one where he says, write as this handbook instructs you, right? I know what this handbook is. Great. And you will be, what will happen? You will be amazed. This is the new knowledge at how much smarter your readers will think you have become. If you don't do this, let's give an example of like, what if we flip the old knowledge and the new knowledge? It doesn't mean that the sentence is terrible, but it just doesn't feel as fluid. It feels clunky. It has friction. So the good sentence here, this handbook tells you how to free yourself of those impediments to effective communication. That's the good one. Let's do the bad one. Free yourself of impediments with how this handbook tells you to write. It just feels weird, right? And I'm like, free myself of impediments? What are we talking about? With what? With this handbook. And the same here. So I don't think I think this one is also pretty straightforward too, is if you look at the sentence one, if I say, you will be amazed at how much smarter your readers will think you have become if you write as this handbook instructs you. But if I flip it, write as this handbook instructs you, and you will be amazed at how much smarter your readers will think you have become. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a recap, right? Like I kind of bluffed at the beginning. I laid out the ideas. Now I'm bluffing at the end. I'm, bottom line. I guess it's not bottom line up front when it's in the back, but I'm restating these big ideas that clarity matters. Clarity is about trust. It's about money, time. Clarity is about a reader's experience. And I kind of love this idea that, if any of you have children, or you have nieces or nephews, or you know any little kids, like one of the best things that can happen is my son will say like, Dad, how does the earth make trees? And I'll go, holy cow, like, how do I even begin? And I could say, well, but I have to build it out of his world, right? I have to be reader centric. So at the end of the day, like, it might be clear to me, but if my son doesn't get it, like, then I'd argue I've not achieved it. I'm not, that's not clarity. So we must be reader centric, despite the fact that every atom in our body is pushing us to be writer centric. That of course this is how I see it, or like, yeah, of course this makes sense. Like, how can it not make sense? Like, what don't you get? These kinds of questions we have to kind of push back against and say, yeah, like, I guess I can imagine some way that this isn't clear, but let me know, right? We want to be proactively, generously, thoughtfully reader centric. And again, that clarity operates at the macro, at the overall text level, and at the micro level, at the sentence level, and they're interacting with one another. And the 5 big keys are the one big idea. One big idea. I often say to my MBA students too, and some of them tell stories that echo this, is that we've all had that situation where you have a presentation for someone, maybe a big one, a client, a boss, something like that. And you've been told, all right, AJ, you've got 20 minutes next Friday to present. And I get there and the boss is going over. And and someone comes out and says, you got 4 minutes. And I can't say, oh, sorry, I need 20. If I can't have 20, I can't do this. You say, all right, cool. I've got 4 minutes. I got to go. What's my one big idea? So we always need to be able to kind of like compress and expand, I think, our writing or communication, depending on the situation. And if you think about it in terms of one big idea, I think all of us can expand. I think the challenge will be to compress. So you start compressing early in order to expand later. Simple structures save us time, save the reader time, save the reader energy when they're reading. Design for clarity, paragraph often, short sentences, lots of white space. Make that thing feel like clean as a bone. Obsess over your subjects, like write sentences going, what is the main idea here? And how can I make it concrete? How can I start with that? And then old knowledge to new knowledge. What does my reader know? And what do I want them to know? And how can I combine those things? And then how can I move my ideas forward based off this old knowledge to new knowledge idea? All right, great. So it looks like we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I'm also up for just not even a Q&A, but just kind of sharing your ideas and sharing your thoughts. So I'd love to hear from anyone about, it could be the house of nightmares in terms of clarity at work. Like, what's some of the worst things you see? What are the major clarity transgressions that we see? for, yeah, anyways, if anyone has any questions or wants to share a text, anything, I'd love to chat about it.
And guys, as we're winding things down, I do just want to make a couple of quick announcements. We have some awesome events coming up for the B2B units. So on Thursday, Tom and I are doing our regular ProWritingAid 101 in case you need a walkthrough of the tool. Some of that is going to cover some of the clarity topics that we covered today. So that is on Thursday. It is a new day and a new time just for this month for the holidays. And that is going to be Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern rather than 2 p.m. Eastern. The other thing is that if you guys enjoyed this webinar and you want to help direct us on future topics, we would love to get your opinions. So I'm going to pop a quick survey into the chat. And that is just 3 questions that is going to cover basically what kind of writing you do, what line of work you're in, and then any topics that you would like to see covered in future workshops, because we are building this around what you guys would like to do. So we would greatly appreciate your feedback on that. And then finally, we have a fantastic session lined up for our workshop in January. Again, we know December is super busy for everybody, and we hope everyone is having a wonderful holiday season during December rather than fussing too much over work. So we are skipping a month and starting our next session in January. That's going to be a great one with Kelly Lamano, who is a contributor to Really Good Emails. And it's going to be all about getting in the mindset of writing great emails. So again, it's going to touch on this getting into your reader's shoes, all of that great stuff. And what do you do before your fingers even hit the keys to start typing everything out? And that, if you would like a reminder to register on that, you can submit that form, and I will make sure that you guys personally get a reminder from me that our registration is up and running, and you will be able to pop on there to make sure you don't miss January session. Again, it's going to be a great one. Kelly is an amazing writer, does fantastic marketing email breakdowns, and we're really looking forward to that session. So lots of events coming up, lots of events going on, and we would love all the feedback that you guys have on the business writing workshops, because like I said, we're doing this, guys, for you guys, and we want it tailored to your needs. So that being said, I think we have some Q&A questions. Okay, AJ, could we pop up the summary slide with the 5 points one more time?
Yeah. And you know, Keisha asked about, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about classes. And you know, I think these webinars, it's interesting because these webinars, not that they function as classes, but maybe we could think of these webinars, you know, Keisha, if you would, you know, just, I don't know, just give us some feedback, and we'd love to, you know, kind of hear more about what you'd love to, you know, do in those classes, or what you'd love to hear about. Yeah, so let me, let me share my screen and go back to the PowerPoint.
And absolutely, guys, and something just to tack on to what AJ's saying is that we definitely want these to be interactive for you guys. So we don't want this to be you're simply sitting through a presentation and, you know, because that's kind of yawn, kind of boring. We want it to be like this, where you have documents that you can read and look at. You have ways that you can see how this stuff applies in real time. And ultimately, we'd love to have it to where you workshop your own work. So that way, you know, maybe we can start doing things where we have dividing up into groups, all that great stuff. But in any case, we want any of those ideas, any of those topics, simply pop into that type form on the Writing at Work survey, and we'll get those noted.
I just wanted to touch on Southern girl wrote about her IT career and technical documentation. I think that's a great example where, like, what happens with technical documentation often is, ideally, you know, you really have people who need to understand this stuff. Like it's kind of like a manual, right? Actions. And I sometimes think that it's helpful frame to think about our emails too. You know, like what if this was a manual? Like what if I were to say, here are the 3 steps, you know, and obviously we have to be careful about that. But your reflection about white space and short sentences, that's great. I've always found that to be the case. And yeah, so and then Jacqueline, I'm really glad that that you downloaded the Plain Language Handbook. I think it's great. And even someone like me who's kind of teaching writing, I often just forget some of these principles. And I love just to go back to the plain language stuff. It feels just, at the end of the day, I mean, I think it just feels very, you know, very human to me. Like just kind of, hey, like, let's just The Facebook's, at one point, Facebook's privacy disclosure, it took 18 minutes to read. And the readability, it was like at a 12th grade reading level. And you just realize, like, come on, like, let's help people understand what they're doing and who they're working with and what's going on. So yeah.
All about making it easy reads.
Yeah, yeah.
Remember, if you're looking at your readability tool in ProWritingAid by any chance, that we usually grade somewhere between a sixth and about a 10th grade level for good readability. So that's a grade level. So that's talking middle school to early high school. Doesn't mean you're necessarily writing to middle schoolers or high schoolers. It just means that that's what generally falls under easy to read categories. So always good ways to apply the tool if you're looking to continue kind of building this clarity in your writing as well. All right, guys, do we have any other questions in the Q&A? Anything else that you would like for AJ to cover? AJ, I think you were so thorough. Everybody just has no questions.
I mean, I'm assuming I was so clear. I was following all 5 keys. Yeah. Right. And I think that the last point I'll make is that if I were to write something, poetic, a short story, a novel, in some ways, these principles become a lot less important because it's a different experience that I'm trying to create. So yeah, I mean, academic writing is, if you just look at academic writing through these principles, it's unbelievable that you just kind of say, holy cow, that sentence is going to take me 3 minutes to figure out. So yeah.
All right. Well, guys, it looks like
the ION is the idea. I think that might be what it be. That's a nominalization. So anytime you take, sometimes what happens is we take verbs and then we change them into clunky nouns that make things sound crazy, right? So in the example that I gave, the nominalization, the ION was the honest negotiations between, the landlords or whatever it may be. And instead, we would say the landlords negotiated honestly. And readers prefer the landlords negotiated rather than the honest negotiations between the landlords, because you can see landlords more concretely than the honest negotiations. It's just harder to see these nominalizations in your brain.
To a certain extent, we can also visualize that verb of negotiations once we've got that subject to attach it to.
It's totally, I know I de-emphasized verbs a little bit today, but you're right. Like the verbs matter. You're right. And the landlords negotiated, like that's a great sentence and verb, right? You can see that. Yeah, that's a great point.
Great. Well, guys, if no one has any other questions, we will go ahead and wrap up. Like I said, if you have any feedback you'd like to give, any topics you would like for us to explore in future workshops, please pop onto those type forms. If you would like a registration reminder for January session, please pop onto that secondary type form. I'm going to just copy those over right now. So the one I'm copying at the moment is going to be the survey type form. And then the one I'm about to copy is going to be the registration notice type form. And all of those, you will get a registration notice if you fill out the one, and we'll be taking all of your ideas to account on the survey. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.